will knock them prone, but also we can shove them 5 feet around us. Now they are within 5 feet of the other enemy and we can cleave them. You could have 24 AC, 4 attacks, and a free shove. Every turn, no resources used. They hit them once, then we get an opportunity attack. We can then hit them, push them back 10 feet, and now they're not within reach of the ally. Welcome to D&D 5.5, or whatever, where martials get a huge boost in the form of Weapon Masteries. Weapon Masteries are a series of abilities that trigger when you hit with a specific weapon. Every weapon in the game has one mastery that it is tied to. Pushing enemies, knocking them down, cleaving through one into another, all these are possible ways of using weapon masteries for your martials. In my mind, the masteries serve a couple purposes. First purpose is to make weapon selection important. Now, choosing between a short sword and a scimitar actually has meaning. Number 2, it has given martials a damage boost, which, generally speaking, was needed. And 3, it gives martials control options. This is something they really lacked in the 2014 version. So now they have a lot of opportunities to control the battlefield the way they want to. In this video, we'll go over all the weapon masteries, how they work, some use cases for them, and how to combo them. This includes some tactics that are really unique and powerful that we've never seen before in 2014. I'll also talk about the controversial subject of weapon juggling. This is the idea of swapping weapons, sometimes multiple times in one turn. We'll talk about the new rules for it, as well as how they can be used and potentially abused. And this is actually a pretty important part of weapon masteries. Okay, starting with the first one alphabetically is Cleave. If you hit a creature with a melee attack using this weapon, you can make a melee attack roll with the weapon against a second creature within 5 feet of the first, that is also within your reach. On a hit, the second creature takes the weapon's damage, but don't add your ability modifier to that damage unless the modifier is negative. You can make this extra attack only once per turn. Okay, so basically you hit one enemy, slice into the next one beside them. Obviously a reach weapon here is really useful because you have a greater chance of being able to use your cleave. There are a couple things I want to point out about how cleave works. On your second attack, only your ability modifier is not added. Any other things are added, such as boosts from Great Weapon Master or Hunter's Mark or whatever else you're adding. The second big thing is that this can only be used once per turn, not once per round. That means you can use it on your turn, and if you get a reaction attack on someone else's turn, you can cleave then too. For example, you get an opportunity attack, you can also hit them and cleave into the next person again. That's a fantastic use of your reaction, to get 2 attacks in. The first one that comes to my mind is using Polearm Master. The way it works is when someone enters the range of your polearm, you can make a reaction attack against them. Then you can make your cleave on another person after that. Now this is a weapon mastery that really benefits from having advantage on that first attack, because if you land that first attack, it enables you to make your second attack. So something like the Barbarian's Reckless Attack is a fantastic combination when used with Cleave. Also, the new Reckless Attack gives you advantage on all your attacks for the round, so even if you have a reaction attack, you can get that and Cleave and have advantage on all of those. I will do a class analysis on the Barbarian later, so I won't go too into it now, but I'm really glad that the Barbarian pairs so well with a giant axe. Now, it might be reasonable to ask, how often is Cleave actually going to happen? I would say pretty regularly in normal circumstances, but if we can combo these, we will be able to get Cleave off very regularly. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Next up on the masteries is Graze. If your attack with this weapon misses a creature, you can deal damage to that creature equal to the ability modifier you use to make the attack roll. This damage is the same damage type dealt by the weapon, and the damage can be increased only by increasing the ability modifier. This is a pretty easy one to understand and use. I can definitely see a new player picking this mastery and sticking to it. It might feel a little bit boring, but always having that reliable damage feels so great when you're playing. Of course, you don't get any extra damage from things like Great Weapon Master or Hunter's Mark or whatever else. Now this one is actually the opposite of Cleave, where if you have advantage, you're less likely to get the Graze to hit. So on builds that consistently get advantage, Graze is probably a bad one to use. It probably pairs pretty well with a fighter who gets a lot of attacks but doesn't consistently have advantage. There is one strange but notable combo that I want to talk about, which is with the Poisoner feat. So you poison your sword, and whenever you damage with that sword, they get poisoned, take some damage, and that poison wears off. But with Graze, you deal damage, but you don't actually hit. So it could be a weird combo. I doubt it. I thought I'd bring it up here because it's a potential combo that people might want to use to exploit the rules as written. Okay, next up is Nick, and this is without doubt the most confusing and complicated weapon mastery out there. The reason is because it relies on ruling from several other sources in the manual, but also several other features that boost two-weapon fighting. Let's take a look at light weapon here first. When you take the attack action on your turn and attack with a light weapon, you can make one extra attack as a bonus action later in the same turn. That extra attack must be made with a different light weapon, and you don't add your ability modifier to the attack's damage unless that modifier is negative. So the idea is essentially you have two light weapons, you attack with one, you can use your bonus action to attack with the other. This is mostly the same as 2014 rules, but with a notable difference in wording. In 2014, it says that these two light weapons need to be in different hands. In these rules, it doesn't say that. It just says a different light weapon. So you can actually do weird things like attack with two different weapons from the same hand, and use the other hand to hold something else like a shield. So you can have a shield, attack, stow it, draw another one, attack with that one. And that's considered two-weapon fighting. This is weapon juggling, and that's why we need to talk about it in this video as well. Now, I don't really know why they made this change. Maybe it's because they feel bad for PCs that only have one hand, and they want them to still feel good in combat, and they're just hoping that optimizers won't abuse it. Ah! Okay, now let's take a look at the actual Nick weapon mastery. When you make the extra attack of the light property, you can make it as part of the attack action instead of as a bonus action. You can make this extra attack only once per turn. So when you use the Nick mastery, instead of attacking, bonus action attack, you can attack and then attack as part of that same action and save your bonus action for something later. This is really great if you fight with two weapons, but have a consistent use of your bonus action, such as Rogue's cunning action. Now they can run in, attack twice, and disengage all in the same turn. The weird thing about it is, it doesn't say which weapon needs to have the Nick mastery. So you could have the Nick mastery on the first weapon or the second weapon, and it doesn't matter. This adds some nice flexibility, but actually it could even be interpreted that you don't need either of them to have the Nick property. But I'm sure nobody is going to rule it that way. But having it in either hand adds some flexibility when it comes to weapon juggling. Now there are two more things I want to talk about related to two-weapon fighting, since we're on the topic. The first is the dual wielder feat. This one is very oddly worded. Let's take a look. Enhanced dual wielding. When you take the attack action on your turn and attack with a weapon that has a light property, you can make one extra attack as a bonus action later on the same turn with a different weapon, which must be a melee weapon that lacks the two-handed property. You don't add your ability modifier to the attack's damage unless the modifier is negative. So this feat kind of seems like it's saying the same thing as the light weapon property, except now the weapon doesn't need to be light, just it doesn't need to be two-handed. But there are two really strange interactions here that aren't obvious or clear. This feat actually gives you an extra attack as a bonus action. So you have your attack, then you have your light weapon property, which is free because of Nick, and then you can have a bonus action to do this dual wielder extra attack as well. So that makes two attacks with our action and one attack with our bonus action for a total of 3. Also, if you have the two-weapon fighting style, which lets you add your ability modifier to your offhand attacks, you can in fact add your ability modifier to the Nick and this dual wielder extra attack. So yes, at level 4, any character can have 3 attacks. And at level 5, anyone with the extra attack feature will get 4 attacks. That sounds like a lot, and it is. But two-weapon fighting was much worse in 2014 than gray weapon fighting. So now they actually end up pretty close, which I'm happy with, despite the odd way they interact and bad wording. Also really strange is that with dual wielder feat, your second weapon doesn't need to be a light weapon, so you could use a longsword or whatnot. But with your light weapon or your Nick property, it still needs to be a light weapon. The dual wielder feat didn't remove that requirement. So there's going to be some weird weapon juggling in order to avoid that. But I doubt people are going to rule it that way. They're probably going to let you use longswords even with the Nick property or light weapon property as well. This is by far the most confusing, and they really could have done a better job wording things and maybe giving examples to make it clearer. Now, push weapon mastery. If you hit a creature with this weapon, you can push the creature up to 10 feet straight away from yourself, if it is large or smaller. This is really close to the Crusher feat that we had in 2014, which still exists in 2024, thankfully. But there's a few key differences. One is that Crusher can move them only 5 feet, but it can move them in any direction. Also, you can only do it once per turn with Crusher. Now you might think because we have the push weapon mastery that Crusher is obsolete, but that's not true. Crusher has some really unique interactions and can be really helpful, especially when pairing it with different weapon masteries. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Forced movement can be great on anybody. It is potentially worse in 2024 because a lot of the emanation effects have changed when they trigger. So forced movement into them often doesn't trigger the effect. Having said that, forced movement just to help people escape grapples or to give distance so they can disengage for free, all of those are still really helpful and useful control points in battle. Sap. If you hit a creature with this weapon, that creature has disadvantage on its next attack roll before the start of your next turn. This one is pretty self-explanatory. It's quite good at low levels when enemies have very few attacks. It gets less and less useful as enemies' attacks increase over time, but it's always still helpful. Next is the slow mastery. If you hit a creature with this weapon and deal damage to it, you can reduce its speed by 10 feet until the start of your next turn. If the creature is hit more than once by weapons that have this property, the speed reduction doesn't exceed 10 feet. This is very similar to the Slasher feat, except you can apply it to multiple creatures. It also stacks with Slasher, and a 20-foot reduction in speed is quite powerful, especially if you've got some vulnerable people behind you or you use kiting tactics. Next is the Topple mastery. If you hit a creature with this weapon, you can force the creature to make a con save. On a failed save, the creature has the prone condition. Interesting that this one doesn't have a size limitation, but push does. I guess you can trip a Tarask, but you can't push it back. Actually, now that I say it out loud, I could maybe see it. This is a fantastic mastery for melee characters. I bet a lot of tables are going to have characters that use Topple to get free advantage for all the melee characters. The ranged people might not be happy with you, but the melee people will be so happy. Now, Constitution saving throws are the highest save in the game, but averaging the con saves out, it actually ends up about having a 50% chance of knocking them prone, from level 1 to 20. So it can stay relevant and useful your entire career. A lot of people worry it's going to slow down combat with con saves going all the time, and I could definitely see that potentially happening. Maybe on VTTs it'll be better because you can roll them up so quick, but I hope it doesn't add a huge slog. I think fighters, paladins, and monks will benefit from this a lot. Note that the quarterstaff has the Topple property, so I can see a lot of monks potentially knocking people prone and then having so many attacks at them while they're prone. Now, this mastery does combo really well with a lot of other masteries, and we're about to get to that once we finish this last one mastery of Vex. If you hit a creature with this weapon and deal damage to the creature, you have advantage on your next attack roll against that creature before the end of your next turn. This is a good mastery for pretty much anybody, except barbarians who constantly have advantage. But I see it especially useful for rogues. I think rogues having Nick and Vex would be a really common combination, where they can get that extra attack for free while still having their bonus action to disengage, and then having a really good chance of having advantage on their offhand attack so that they can get their sneak attack in, even if they don't have an ally close by. I do want to say that the math for doing Vex is pretty complex and annoying because there are so many different combinations that it could be. When are you going to target a new enemy? What other weapons are you attacking with? How many times are you attacking with a Vex weapon versus a non-Vex? Bleh. I'll have to make some calculator for that later. Maybe I'll make it public. Okay, now that we've gone over all the masteries and potential uses for them, let's talk about using multiple masteries in one turn by using weapon juggling. First things first, the designers wanted this to happen. They wanted you to be able to switch weapons even in the same turn. They specifically redesigned the rules to allow for it. In 2014, you could draw or sheath one weapon on your turn. In the 2024 rules, under the attack action, they say this: you can either equip or unequip one weapon when you make an attack as part of this action. You do so either before or after the attack. If you equip a weapon before an attack, you don't need to use it for that attack. Equipping a weapon includes drawing it from a sheath or picking it up. Unequipping a weapon includes sheathing, stowing, or dropping it. They clearly want you to be able to swap weapons easily. In D&D's own video about weapon masteries, they even talked about this specific use case. Take a look.
The tactical possibilities start multiplying, particularly if you have weapon mastery and you're also playing a class that eventually gets extra attack, because you can start using one weapon for one of those attacks and another weapon for the other one and exploit their different mastery properties to create some fascinating tactical combinations yourself.
So it seems pretty clear to me that they intended this. Side note, if you take the dual wielder feat, you can draw or stow 2 non-two-handed weapons at the same time. Also, you can only draw or stow weapons as part of your attack action. That means if you have an attack granted to you from a bonus action or a reaction, you cannot draw or stow weapons with that attack. So with Nick, since we moved that attack from the bonus action to our attack action, now we can use it to draw or stow weapons. But the dual wielder feat gives us a bonus action to do an extra attack. For that one, we cannot draw or stow weapons. I will say I don't really like the idea of weapon juggling, but I do love the control and the tactics that switching weapon masteries out brings. I do worry it will add extra complexity to battles and make things even longer and sloggier. I'm sure that's a word. Now, if they're juggling weapons, marshals need to remember what weapons they're holding from last turn, as well as think about how they'll switch their weapons and in which order to do their masteries. Now, marshals and casters might have the same length of turn. They did fix the marshal caster divide. Alright, now let's get to the most interesting part of what I have to say. Tactics. How can we combine these weapon masteries to form tactics we didn't have before? The first one is Super Cleave. This is the idea that we can pair masteries with Cleave in order to maximize our Cleave potential. If you already have 2 people beside each other just waiting to be cleaved, what you can do is first use a weapon that will topple the enemy, then switch to a weapon that will cleave. For example, you start with a maul and you topple the first one, then you stow your maul as part of that first attack. Part of your second attack, you can then draw your halberd, and then that can be used to cleave. Now your first attack has advantage because they're prone, which means you're very likely to get that second cleave attack to happen. Another way of increasing your likelihood to cleave is by taking the Crusher feat. Now, for example, we have an enemy above us and below us. What we can do is we can hit with our maul again. This then will knock them prone, but also we can shove them 5 feet around us. Now they are within 5 feet of the other enemy and we can cleave them with advantage. If enemies are further spread out, we could use a push mastery weapon. Then we could shove them close up to another enemy, run up, and cleave through them both. And if we end our turn with a cleave weapon on us still, we can potentially get an extra cleave attack with our opportunity attacks if they come up. And if you have Polearm Master, that would be pretty easy to trigger. Note that we started our turn with a maul, ended our turn with a halberd. Our next turn we're going to start with a halberd, so we end up with this flip-flopping back and forth. See what I mean about marshals having to keep track of what weapon they're holding now? So that one was pretty basic. Let's talk about a more interesting one. This is the Topple Lance. With this, we use the Lance weapon. This is now just a regular polearm. It's heavy and two-handed, and it has reach. But it also has the Topple property. What you do is you have Polearm Master with this lance, move forward, attack them once, maybe twice, knock them prone. Then you move back 5 feet, and you wait for them to approach you on their turn. They stand up using half their movement, they move forward 5 feet, and then that triggers the Polearm Master attack, where you then can attack with the lance and knock them prone again. Then they'll have to use half their movement again, which they don't have because they already used up half their movement plus 5 feet. So they have a couple options. One is they can use their dash action to stand back up and move. 2 is they could crawl the rest of their distance, which is possible. I doubt DMs would do this often, but even if they do, all their attacks will be at disadvantage. The nice thing about this is it works with enemies of any speed, since it depends on half their movement twice. So maybe the Force Lance lives on in spirit? Another option that might be more consistent on enemies that have 30 feet movement would be to pair the slow mastery with the slasher feat, and then pair that with polearm master that would do a push attack. This next tactic uses the Sentinel feat, and guarding with Sentinel is really good in this edition. The Sentinel feat, when you hit with an opportunity attack, reduces the speed of that enemy to 0 for the rest of their turn. Also, if someone within 5 feet of you hits another person with an attack, you can make an opportunity attack against them. Now we can pair that with the push weapon mastery. For example, we have an enemy that is attacking our ally beside us. They hit them once, then we get an opportunity attack. We can then hit them, push them back 10 feet, and now they're not within reach of the ally, and hopefully not within reach of anybody. And they then have to waste the rest of their attacks because their speed is 0, they can't move, and hopefully no one's within their range. Especially later on when enemies get so many attacks, being able to stop them after one attack and consistently end their turn is fantastic. Even better, if you take the Crusher feat and you attack with a weapon that topples, what you can do is when you defend your ally, you can hit them back 5 feet away from anybody and knock them prone. Their speed is 0, so they cannot get up from prone. They have to end their turn prone. And that by itself is really strong. The last one is what I call swords and board. Since you can do 2-weapon fighting with only one hand now, what you can do is do several odd things that make you really effective at both defense and offense. We get plate mail and a shield, and then we juggle weapons with our main hand. You can pick up the 2-weapon fighting style for extra damage, and you can actually pick up the dueling style for extra damage as well. Maybe even the thrown weapon style if you're throwing them. Then for our defenses, we can pick up the defensive duelist feat. This one lets us use our reaction to add our proficiency bonus to our AC for the entire round. Later, you can even pick up the shield mastery feat to get an extra shove attack for free. So at level 5, you can have 23 AC and 4 attacks. And then at level 9, you could have 24 AC, 4 attacks, and a free shove. Every turn, no resources used. So in this edition, sword and board is just as bad as it was perhaps, but swords and board is quite good. So these are just a couple of ideas of using weapon masteries in cool and interesting ways that martials have never dreamed of before. They give martials an amazing amount of control, way more than I thought possible. They can potentially even out-control casters at low level. I do also want to say that I'm actually really amazed at how well balanced everything is. Now using different weapon styles, almost anything is viable. You can use swords and board, you can use 2-weapon fighting, great weapon fighting, thrown weapons, and all of them are good and viable, and actually pretty close to one another. And the weapon masteries that boost damage are actually pretty comparable to each other. So I feel like every playstyle has a way to be quite powerful, except sword and board has a strange way of doing it. I'm really excited to see what crazy combos people come up with regarding weapon masteries. Thanks for sticking through this all. I hope that you learned something interesting. For my next videos, I'm going to start doing class analysis to look at damage, control, durability of all the classes and compare them to 2014. I was going to start there now, but I thought we really need to see weapon masteries and how they interact first because they're so vital to how we're analyzing martials. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope to see you next time.